My wife placed the papers on the table and stated she would keep the house and the children, leaving me with nothing. I signed without hesitation. My lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Are you serious?" She called the entire family to celebrate. I was smiling because she had overlooked something. Brenda dropped the papers on the table with such force that the sound echoed through the room. She looked at me intensely and pointed at the documents as if the outcome was already decided before I spoke. "I'm keeping the house, the children, and you won't get any of it." Adolfo, my lawyer, leaned closer, his voice tense and urgent. "Aurelio, are you serious? Don't sign that. You know what this means." I picked up the pen and signed without pause. Brenda called her sister, Juana. That same night, I heard them celebrating from the hallway. Laughter, toasts, words that cut sharply. She believed she had defeated me, that she had secured everything. But I was smiling because Brenda, in her certainty, had forgotten something that would change everything. The moment she signed those papers in front of the judge, that mistake would cost her everything she believed she had won, every cent, every square meter, every early celebration. To understand that moment, I need to go back 18 years. This didn't begin with a divorce. It began much earlier, in silence, with small details I ignored for too long, glances I avoided, questions I never asked, truths I chose not to see because it was easier to believe everything was fine. I met Brenda when we were both 27. She had a presence that filled any room. She spoke loudly, laughed freely, and had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the world. I was an engineer, working 12-hour days, sleeping little, and aiming to build something of my own. I didn't have much materially at the time, but she said it didn't matter. "We'll build it together," she told me early on, in a calm, reassuring tone. I believed her completely. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony with both families. It wasn't extravagant, but it meant everything to me. My mother, Lydia, held my hand before we entered the church and quietly said something I didn't fully understand at the time. A man who builds must know well who he builds with. I thought it was simply emotional advice. Later, I realized she had seen something I had chosen to ignore. The first few years were stable, or at least that's what I told myself whenever something felt off. We worked, saved, and had children. I kept pushing forward, long hours, missed weekends, postponed plans, focused entirely on growing what I had started. By then, I had built my own company from the ground up, with my decisions, my connections, and my name on every contract and risk. Brenda didn't work there at first, but gradually she began attending meetings. She said she wanted to support me, to understand my work, to be involved in something important. I saw it as commitment, as partnership, as growth in our marriage. Now I understand I misread the situation. Around the 8th year, I started noticing small inconsistencies, expenses that didn't align when reviewing bank statements, calls that ended quickly when I entered a room, her phone put away too quickly, work trips extending longer than expected, always with reasonable explanations. She always had answers, smooth, convincing, without visible gaps. She was very skilled at providing explanations. I should have recognized that earlier. One Tuesday morning, without warning or prior argument, Brenda entered the kitchen and calmly told me she wanted a divorce. She showed no emotion, no hesitation. She didn't look at me for a reaction. She said it as if it were a routine decision, something already finalized long before being spoken. At that moment, as I stood there with my coffee cooling on the counter, something became clear. Not with anger or pain, but with a calm understanding. Because I had been preparing for that moment for weeks, without her knowing. Weeks of quiet discussions with Adolfo. Weeks of collecting information she assumed I would never find. Weeks of building something carefully and quietly. She believed the divorce marked her victory. For me, it was the moment I had been waiting. When she placed those papers on the table, when my lawyer questioned my decision, when I signed without hesitation, it wasn't surrender. It was part of the plan. That night, after she left the room satisfied, I sat alone in the living room. We had never discussed buying those properties. They had never come up in any conversation about investments or shared assets. They appeared without my knowledge, funded with money that came from what I had built and registered through structures designed so I wouldn't find them unless I knew exactly where to look. Adolfo carefully gathered the documents and placed them into a thick folder, already filled with evidence. He looked at me with the calm expression of someone who has seen difficult cases for years and is no longer surprised. "Adolfo," he said, "this is not just a complex divorce. This involves fraud, diversion of assets, and concealment. If the prosecutor's office gets involved, and with this level of evidence, they likely will, this goes beyond family court." I nodded. I understood the seriousness of the situation. I also knew we had to proceed carefully, because there were two people I needed to protect above all else, my children. They had no responsibility in this, and I was not willing to let them become collateral damage. I made it clear to Adolfo that every legal step had to prioritize their protection and keep them as far removed from the conflict as possible. He understood immediately. As a father himself, he knew that how I handled this would matter in court. Meanwhile, Rodrigo continued coming to the office as if nothing had happened. That was the most difficult part for me internally, seeing him arrive each morning, greet the staff naturally, and go about his day. I responded normally, attended meetings, and listened as he presented reports I now knew were misleading. Maintaining that composure required discipline. There was an afternoon when Rodrigo came into my office and casually mentioned he had heard about the divorce. He said he was sorry and that I could count on him if I needed anything. He extended his hand, I shook it and thanked him. As he walked away, I thought about the $480,000, the 3 properties, and the months of transfers he had executed while maintaining that same friendly attitude. I said nothing. I knew the right moment to speak was still ahead, and when it came, the evidence would be enough. One Monday morning, Adolfo called me before I left the house. His tone was different, not urgent, but focused. "Aurelio, I need you here today, not tomorrow." I arrived at his office shortly after. He was standing, which was unusual. Papers covered his desk, and an extra folder sat on the chair. He looked at me and said, "We found something else." The forensic accountant had continued tracing the financial movements beyond what we had already identified. In reviewing international transfer records connected to Brenda's shell company, he found that part of the money had not stayed local. It had been transferred abroad in carefully structured amounts below reporting thresholds. The pattern was clear. It indicated not just concealment, but preparation for an exit strategy, a separate financial base outside the country. The divorce was not the final step in her plan. It was one of the last steps. I reviewed the documents in silence and then asked how much had been transferred internationally. "Approximately $110,000 over 8 months, Adolfo replied. Combined with the earlier $480,000 and the value of the 3 properties, the total exceeded $900,000. These assets had been distributed in ways designed to be difficult to trace and recover. I asked whether Rodrigo knew about the international transfers. Adolfo explained that the accountant believed Rodrigo handled the initial movements, while Brenda later took control of the international side. Proving each person's exact involvement would require further investigation. That brought us to the next stage. Until then, we had focused on documenting and understanding the scope. Now it was time to act. Adolfo outlined 2 options. The first was to present everything in family court as part of the divorce response, challenging the agreement based on asset concealment and fraud. This would allow the court to freeze assets immediately. The second was to file a criminal complaint, fraud, diversion of assets, and possibly money laundering due to international transfers. This would involve additional authorities and take longer, but would expand the scope significantly. I asked for his recommendation. After considering it carefully, he said, "Both. We proceed in family court to secure immediate protection, and at the same time, we initiate the criminal process." It was the correct approach. The following week was intense but discreet. Adolfo and the accountant prepared the documentation for both filings. I reviewed every detail.
The file was extensive and precise, leaving little room for dispute. At home, nothing appeared different.
The confidence from the first few weeks had completely faded. In its place, a new tension emerged, visible in small details that only someone who had known her for 18 years could read clearly. The way she held her phone, how quickly she responded when spoken to, and how she avoided certain topics in front of the children with an awkwardness that didn't match her usual ability to manage appearances. Her lawyer visited often. At times, a woman I didn't recognize also came. From fragments of conversation, I understood she was likely an accountant or financial advisor Brenda had hired to assess the full scope of her situation. These meetings lasted for hours, and when they ended, Brenda would come out with an expression that had been gradually hardening, like someone receiving bad news in stages and building a shell to hide its impact. Rodrigo had disappeared from the company. Not suddenly, not through confrontation or a formal resignation. He simply became absent. First a day, then two, then a full week. His emails were answered more slowly. His responsibilities were neglected. The staff began to ask questions, and I gave neutral answers that explained nothing because it wasn't yet time to explain. What I did do, with Adolfo's advice, was formally begin reviewing his position as a partner. It was necessary and appropriate for the company and for the employees who had no responsibility in what had happened and deserved a serious resolution. One morning, 5 days before the hearing, Adolfo called me for a final preparation meeting. We reviewed the structure of the presentation, the order of evidence, and the points where Brenda's lawyer might challenge the documentation, along with how those challenges would be addressed. I arrived at his office at 10 a.m. The full case file was spread across the table, organized into clearly marked sections. It was thick, the kind of document that immediately signals months of careful work rather than something prepared in haste. We spent 4 hours reviewing everything. Adolfo explained each section, highlighted key points, and prepared me for questions from both the judge and opposing counsel. He also detailed how he would present the evidence of international transfers, ensuring it would be clear and precise, neither softened nor exaggerated. When we finished, he gathered the papers and looked at me. "How are you?" he asked, genuinely. I told him the truth. I said I was fine, though there were moments when the weight of everything felt heavier. Some nights I stayed awake longer than I wanted, thinking about my children and how this would affect them. But I also had clarity. I knew what I was doing was right, and that was enough to keep me steady. He nodded. A judge notices when someone is there for the right reasons and when someone is there just to win. That difference matters. I left with that thought in mind. The days before the hearing passed slowly. Brenda barely spoke at home. The children sensed the tension, even if they didn't understand it, and I made an effort to maintain normal routines: homework, movies, conversations about their day, small things that build stability. The night before the hearing, I slept little. Not from fear, but from a sense that something irreversible was approaching. I sat in my study with a cup of coffee that went cold, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. There was no anger left. That had faded early on. What remained was a quiet determination, the kind that doesn't need last-minute reassurance. I slept after 1 a.m., set my alarm for 6, and before turning off the light, I lay still, aware that the next day would change everything. The morning of the hearing was clear. I woke before the alarm, prepared calmly, and dressed in a dark gray suit with a blue tie Lydia had given me years earlier, my way of marking important days. I had coffee in the same place where I had signed the papers weeks before. Brenda was also awake. The house carried that silence that comes when two people prepare for the same moment from opposite positions. The children were still asleep, cared for by Lydia, who had arrived the day before without questions.
I arrived at the courthouse early. Adolfo was already there. We went in together. The hearing room was functional